something I wanted to kind of touch back on is you mentioned the Civil War, and this is I'm going to put on my fundamentalist hat, and I'm going to challenge you. The Civil War, we probably have I don't know enough about it. I don't know anything about American history to be honest, because I grew up in Australia. But the Civil War, I'm sure
Exactly.
there are lots of I'm sure there are a lot of stories of like legendary accounts of like soldiers or doing miraculous things or crazy stunts or something right in this war. Um, and they may or may not be true. They may be, but some might be completely false or made up or embellished. But you would never argue that there wasn't a civil war. So, what a Christian might say, and what I might say as a fundamentalist, Dave, here, I might say, well, yes, there's muddy details all over the place, but they all tell the story about, a person born of a virgin. Well, Mark doesn't, but born, does some
John doesn't
miracles,
either, but
dies, yeah, dies, and resurrects. Right? We all, and that's the point. So, what do you say to someone who says like, well, they all say the same thing? This person died and resurrected and is now the Son of God. So, what do you say to someone who says, yes, all these details might be muddy, but the main point still stands? And in fact, even more. It's even more evidence that the main point did actually happen because they all agree on those points, right?
well, I mean, so I guess there's a couple of things there. Like one thing, I wouldn't say that you can talk about one individual's life at the same level as you would like the Civil War. Like, okay, I think we
Yeah.
can agree that the Roman Empire happened, and that would be more like comparable for me to say like
Oh yeah.
the
Yeah.
Civil War.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like, but that's the thing that happens a lot of times is that like you can get into discussions with people about things like that, like oh, the memory of the Civil War and the memory of Jesus, it must be the same. And it's like, okay, sure, like, yeah, but at the end of the day, like you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that experience the Civil War and experience different aspects of it. And so when they tell a story, those stories are probably going to be relatable for people in other places and be able to say, yeah, that was something similar to what happened with me, or these, and it's all relatable. And so like, I would say that those kind of legendary tales of people or whatever are actually more similar to the story of Jesus, right? Because it would be that you have a similar world, a similar worldview that's going on, and then when people say, "Hey, this happened with this guy down in Judah or whatever," everybody's like, "Yeah, cool." Like, I mean, it's relatable. It makes sense. Like, nobody needs to check the facts, not because everybody agrees that it happened, but because your worldview accepts that this is something that would have happened. And so some of the the placement of it is all there, but it's not actually a comparable thing to say that, hey, we remember the Civil War. Like it's more like, hey, was Abraham Lincoln exactly like every depiction of him was?
Yeah. Was he a vampire hunter?
Right? Was he a vampire
Um,
hunter? And
yeah.
did he actually win the Great War? Things like that. But what? So I think that's like where we tend to get confused. Like we just tend to try and equate things that both are problematic. And on the one hand, because like we just have a lot more records of the Civil War than we do of Jesus, and so it's like it's not really relatable, and two, that it's just like the individual details of an individual's life is something very, very different than the broad view that something happened, like in broad terms. And so that's
Mm.
something I've talked about before, that like one of the biggest problems is scope, right? And so like we tend to, as historians, like we look when we're looking at some things that happened in the past, like the bigger the scope, the easier it is to say that it happened. And so like I feel very confident that Egypt had a culture in the past. Okay, I'm very confident that the Babylonians were also had a culture in the past,
Hmm.
and so I feel very confident as a historian to say that. I also feel very confident to say that the Egyptians had a very early culture for writing and for, say, burying their dead in grand places, and that they built pyramids. But when we start to say like, now which king was king when, I feel like even though we have pretty good records from some antique sources, it's already there. It's a bit more difficult to say, like,
Mm.
because these sources are reliant on an understanding of Egyptian history that comes like some from Herodotus or some a Greek historian or something like that, and so we don't know always whether this king was actually that king. Like, there's some places where we're pretty clear because we have many sources, like we have inscriptions that name someone, and then we have then can relate them to their parents or to their children. We can reconstruct it pretty good. And then we have other places where we're kind of like, what happened here? Like what is this
Mm.
what is this period, intervening period here? Like what really happened? Who was really there? And so we can end up with these questions like, okay, what exactly happened during this time? And we sometimes we don't know. And that's okay. Like as a historian,
Mm.
your goal isn't to say we know everything, but it's rather to say what we do know in a structured way. And
And
so, like, and the closer you get to an individual's life and their actual deeds, the less likely we are to be getting it right. And so it's like, take a big old picture, and it can look really really clear, but the more you zoom in, the more
it's
pixelated it
blurry.
gets. Yeah,
Yeah. It's like you could say that a king reigned probably from these two dates, but did he like take a golden sword, and slaughter 500 men on his own? Like
right.
that story is a bit like out there. So it's like, even though a couple of people tell it, it's like, what are the chances of someone doing that? Do they have motives for doing that, for telling that story?
Right.
Um, th- So I would love to ask, what are some common misunderstandings about translations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big one is probably the reason we're having this discussion is just that a translation can be true or right or correct or something like that. I think is the biggest thing out there that irks me. That like and this happens also, like this happens from both ends of the spectrum. Like, you hear a lot of scholars, like they only use the NRSV or whatever, and like because that's the best translation. Well, like, yeah, okay, sure, it's the trend. The New Revised Standard Version is the one that will probably get you closest to the word for word reading of a passage and help you identify what Greek or Hebrew word is behind what you're reading.
Mm.
Sure, but that doesn't mean it's the best. Like it a lot of times maybe doesn't convey the sense over a phrase or over a whole passage that is most communicative to the reader. And so that's why we have
Mm.
other things, like the NIV or the ESV or all these other translations. And I mean, you can go as far as like the Message and the Living Bible and these things that are like really paraphrasing everything. Like I don't have a problem with that either, like because they're
Mm.
they're trying to say what's the sense and how do you bring that into our context, because it has to happen somewhere, right? This contextualization, this interpretation has to happen somewhere. And so, like when you say, "Well, Jesus, said this or did that," and people say, "Oh, well, if you read it in the best translation, it's going to be telling you exactly what the Greek says." But sometimes it's so jarbled and jumbled that you don't understand what really happens.
Yeah.
So, like my feeling is that one of the things we tend to forget is just that, yeah, that fact that people do automatically try to make sense of what they're reading or hearing or stuff like that. And then they're going to be using their cultural clues or whatever to fill it in. I mean, and
Mm.
that's part of the reason why we study ancient languages when we study, when you study theology or whatever, or, traditionally, is that if you understand Hebrew and Greek and Latin and Syriac and all these languages that have sources that you're reading, you have a better chance of kind of filling in these gaps with something that's relatable, but you're still so far removed that you need to do it critically.